Yo guys, how's it going? AKMoto here. The time has finally come and the 125's motor is finally ready for assembly. Now off camera I did some little stuff here and there. I went in and honed our cylinder. I'll put some pictures up on the screen right now, but after inspecting it I noticed that it was getting pretty glazed up after 125 hours of use. It definitely needed a hone, so I honed that up real quick and it's good to go. And of course we did our port matching. If you guys haven't seen the last video, I did a little bit of port matching, and yeah, definitely check out the last video if you guys didn't see that. And yeah, we also got the cases vapor honed, as you guys can see here. I had these vapor honed by Retro MX Restorations on Instagram. Hit him up if you guys need any vapor honed, Cerakote, stuff like that. Check out his Instagram page. He does some really cool work, and yeah, I'll put his Instagram handle on the screen right now. So here are our cases. They're all bare and ready to go. All we gotta do is install our bearing and seals, our transmission, and all that good stuff. Over here we have our parts. Still gotta shine up our clutch cover over here, but other than that, pretty much everything's good to go as it sits. I rebuilt the crank. If you guys haven't seen what parts we're using, in the first video I made of this series, I went a little more in depth on what we're using and why we're using it. And yeah, we also got that cylinder head right over there. Now here, first thing we're going to start with today is our crank bearings. We're going to install our crank bearings and seals, and then we'll move on to our transmission bearings and seals as well. And to install these bearings, I'll be using this Harbor Freight 20-ton press I have here in the shop. Let's get started. Alright guys, so our main bearings are now in place. I'm going to go in and install our new OEM crank seals. Alright guys, so we have our crank bearings and seals in place, both OEM Yamaha. Next thing to do will be to install our transmission bearings here and the transmission seals, like the countershaft seals. Some of the other seals I kind of put in early, like the shift shaft seal right down here. But we have to install our transmission bearings and seals. Now before we do that, I gotta quickly go run and get some race gas for this bike because we are going to be running a high compression head, and running a high compression head just simply won't work on our pump fuel. So I'm gonna have to go get some fuel for this bike, so I will be right back and we can install our transmission bearings. Alright guys, we are back. Got some fuel over there. Now we can start assembling the transmission components. We're going to start with the bearings again, as I said earlier. So let's press in some of these transmission bearings, and I'll also get the seals in as well. Alright guys, so we have all of our bearings, main and transmission bearings, and their corresponding seals in place. Now I'm going to go in and install our crankshaft into our crank bearings, and we're also going to slide in our transmission, and after that we can start with sealing up the cases. But first, let's get our transmission and our crank in here, and I like to start on the right case for this. And here for my crankshaft, I'm actually reusing my OEM crank, or at least the webs, but I went in and rebuilt this crankshaft myself. And I used a Pro X connecting rod rebuild kit. It comes with our connecting rod, obviously, big end and little end bearings, our thrust washers, and of course our crank pin. So this crank is all good to go. I trued it up myself, and now we just have to install it into the case. We'll see if it slips in. If it doesn't slip into place, normally they won't. You'll need to use a crankshaft installer specialty tool. So let's see if this one slips all the way in. Probably not though. Yeah, as I suspected, it went most of the way in, as it should, but we're gonna need to use our crankshaft installation tool, so let me go get that. Alright guys, so the crankshaft is installed into the right case here. Now one thing you want to do is you want to just give this a quick tap with a brass hammer or a rubber mallet, and that'll just make sure this side of the crank isn't bound up with the bearing. This crank isn't bound up, but sometimes I've had cranks pull in to where they're a little bit bound up until you give them a quick little tap. And they'll start moving freely, and yeah, this one's moving nice and freely. And yeah, now we can get the transmission into place. Alright, so here I have my transmission. I'm just going to interlock these and drop them down into place. There we go. Now of course it won't spin freely because there's nothing holding these gears into place, so they're kind of locked up right now. But this bike, there's no washers or anything between the bearings that we have to worry about. Alright, so now I'm going to install our shift forks, and the casting actually has letters that help you kind of figure out where each one goes. This one has a C on it, and that marks for the center of this engine in particular. So here I'm just going to slide these into place. Now here you guys can see I can spin these two shafts independently of one another, so I can spin this one and this one in the center won't move. Now of course you'll see gears moving here because these are constant mesh transmissions here in these dirt bikes, but you can see I can move one independently of the other if I need to, and yeah, that's just showing that we're in neutral. And of course I took a lot of pictures beforehand so I can line everything up how it came out, but yeah, so just wanted to show you guys that real quick, how you know you're in neutral. Spin one independently of each other, and yeah, here I'm gonna throw some transmission oil on this, and then we're gonna get some sealant here on our case gasket surface. These Yamahas use sealant and not a gasket, so I'm gonna get some sealant on here, get a few dowel pins in here and there, and we can get these cases going back together. Alright guys, we have everything we need to install in place. Now I'm gonna install our left case onto the right case here and get these cases going back together. Alright guys, so I have all the bolts just ran down to where they're touching the case.
They're not tight or anything. I just let this sit for a few minutes, and now we're gonna go in and torque these bolts down, or just snug them down. I'm not gonna torque them because I don't really think it's necessary. So I'm just gonna snug them up with a 1/4" ratchet here, and we're gonna do a crisscross pattern for the initial tightening. But after that, I'm probably just gonna go one by one just because we're barely moving the bolt. So let's get to it. Alright guys, so we have all the bolts pretty much snugged down evenly, but I'm going to go through one more time just to make sure they're all nice and snug. And we're good to go. Now here, this isn't totally necessary. The engine is going to run no different by us doing this, but I'm going to go through and wipe any excess sealant here on the outside of the case, just to kind of clean it up a little bit. Alright guys, so I didn't show this on camera, but I quickly installed the little intercollar for our countershaft seal right here, and I also installed our clutch actuator arm right here, and that's all we're going to be doing on this side of the motor for now. Let's move on to the clutch side, where we can start installing some of our shifting components as well as our clutch components, our power valve governor, some stuff like that. Alright, to start us off on our shifting components, I'm going to install this tensioner arm that will put spring tension on our shift drum detent. Now I'm going to hold this tensioner back like so, and I'm going to install our shift drum detent. I'm actually going to use a small screwdriver to hold this out of the way. Be careful though, because this could spring back if your screwdriver slips. Now here, before I put tension on this shift drum detent, I'm going to install the bolt here. Get this most of the way on. Now we can let the tensioner do its thing once we have this most of the way on. It's very important that this is in the notch in the shift drum, so here I'm going to just try and wiggle it back and forth and make sure everything's lined up. Now I'm going to torque it down. And next I'm going to try and get the engine into neutral. We don't have to do this, but it might help a little bit in the future. There we go, we're now in neutral. And now the last piece for our shifting mechanism will be our shift shaft, which will slide right into place just like this. Over here by the right side crank seal, we have a seal retainer we can install. Next up, we'll go in idler gear for our kickstart shaft. It connects our kickstart shaft gear to our clutch basket. To hold all this in place, we have a tiny little circlip to install. Just make sure you get that snapped on into place. Here we need to give it a little push just to get it into the groove. You'll probably hear it click here. And there we go. Next is our kickstart shaft. Alright guys, so we have all of our shifting components in place with our Kickstarter and a little gear here. Now I'm going to go in and install our primary drive gear along with our clutch hub and our clutch basket and all that. Next we have a washer, then our inner clutch hub. Here we have our locking washer. This is a brand new OEM one right here. And finally we have our clutch hub nut. Here I'm going to torque our primary drive gear to 35 pound-feet of torque, and I'm going to use a gear jammer tool. Now I'm going to torque our clutch hub nut down to 58 pound-feet of torque. Alright guys, so I went in and torqued down our primary drive gear bolt as well as our clutch hub nut here, and I also bent down that little locking tab, so it's all good to go. And now I'm going to move on to installing our case cover here, that cover that kind of goes on top of all this stuff, covers the kickstart and whatnot. And then we're going to install the clutch plates right after that. Now here, for our clutch or our case cover, I actually got that Cerakoted, and that thing looks super chic. Let's get a look at this thing. So here I already have the water pump already rebuilt, and I installed the seal, or the kickstart shaft seal right there. And yeah, this is all pretty much good to go, ready for installation. And I had that Cerakote by Retro MX Restorations. Again, I'll put his Instagram on the screen. If you guys need any Cerakote work or any vapor blasting, you guys hit him up. He does really good work. Now here, before we put our gasket on, this is something I've been doing for pretty much all the gasket surfaces on this engine. I'm going to put a light coat of waterproof grease all along the gasket surface, and this will just make sure that the next time we need to take off this gasket, it's not going to stick and bake onto the case. It just makes installation and removal a little bit easier. And here, this is just a normal waterproof grease, like a bearing grease. So here I just slid on our 2 dowel pins. Now I'm going to put on our gasket here. And what's also nice about putting on the grease is it also tends to just kind of hold the gasket in place where you want it. Of course the dowel pins will align it, but the grease does help a little bit for just aligning the gasket where you need it. Alright, now I'm just going to slide on our case cover. I put some grease on its gasket surface as well. We need to line up our dowel pins. That side's good. We're just going to give this side a little tap with a rubber mallet just to kind of help it on a little. That's all it takes. And we're pretty much on. I'll tap. And we are good to go. Now we're gonna install our bolts. And from that we have some new bolts from our hardware kits. Alright, so we have all of our bolts in place. Now I'm gonna go in and snug them all up. Alright, so now that we have all of our bolts in place, I'm going to snug them down with our 1/4" ratchet. And for the initial tighten, I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern. Just going to go in and snug each bolt down individually. Alright guys, so I actually forgot to shine up my clutch cover and then my little case saver here. So I'm going to do that real quick here on the Prime MX cleaning wheel. I'm just using a fine wheel here on a bench grinder. And yeah, I just kind of forgot to shine it up, so I'm going to do that right now. Alright guys, so I just finished up shining the clutch cover, and it's all good to go. I'll show you guys that here in a minute. But first we're going to put on our clutch plates. Then we also have this little actuator arm to install here in the middle. Throw some oil for those. So here I am going to be reusing our old clutch plates. They're not warped or anything from heat, and they still look pretty good, the fibers at least. So I have no reason to replace these. Honestly, clutches aren't hard to replace anyway, so even if this one does wear out in 50 hours, you know, it wouldn't be hard at all for us to replace. We have this little clutch bearing. I'm going to add some more oil. Our outer clutch pressure plate goes on next. And finally we have our clutch springs and clutch bolts. These are OEM Yamaha springs, stock stiffness. Here for these clutch bolts, I'm just going to use my 1/4" ratchet, yet again, 10mm socket. Just going to snug these down to where they're seated, and we'll be good to go. So here I'm going to throw some grease on our gasket surface. Unfortunately, Yamaha doesn't use an O-ring anymore. They use an actual paper gasket. I'd prefer the O-ring because you can reuse that more often. But anyway, we're just going to grease up our gasket surface here again, just so our gasket doesn't get stuck in the future. Here I'm going to install the freshly shined up clutch cover. Oh yeah, guys, that looks really, really nice. As I have most of this video, I'm going to snug these bolts down with a 1/4" ratchet. And they even gave us a new bolt for our check bolt, or our oil check bolt right here, so I'm going to replace that as well. And here I'm actually going to throw some grease on the threads of this bolt because this bolt's threading right into the magnesium cover, and a lot of the times these bolts won't really want to come loose. So I'm going to throw some grease on the threads. Hopefully that can help it come out next time we need to take it out. Here, we'll just thread this little guy back in. And I really like this bolt that's included because it's an 8mm instead of an Allen key, and in my eyes these are going to be less likely to strip out. Now here, because we just got done shining it up and I don't want to do it later, I'm going to install our case cover, or our case saver. Alright guys, so I'm now going to install our reed cage assembly. Here I'm going to yet again grease up our gasket surfaces. So here, because I have an aftermarket Boyson reed cage, I had to get a gasket for this reed cage, kind of specially made for this reed cage. This is a Boyson rad valve. It's essentially a whole new aftermarket reed cage assembly that's just a little bit better designed than OEM. And then of course we have to use the gasket made by them. We'll just drop this in place. And we have some new bolts for our reeds as well. We're about ready to throw the top end onto this motor. Here real quick, I'm going to put down our cylinder base gasket. I'm just going to put a little grease down, and real quick we have to check our piston to cylinder clearance and our ring end gap clearance, and I'll show you guys how I'm going to do that. Alright guys, so here we have the cylinder. It's been vapor honed or vapor blasted. I honed the cylinder itself because it was starting to glaze up pretty bad. I'll show you guys some pictures on your screen now. But the cylinder was definitely getting pretty glazed up, so I know a lot of people are against honing 2-stroke cylinders, but in this case it was only purely beneficial. But anyway, here I'm just going to get my new Pro X piston. This is a cast piston, what I'm going to be running in this build. I'm just going to install it into our cylinder. It doesn't have any rings on it right now. Here we'll make sure we orientate it the right way. It doesn't really matter too much, but now I'm just going to get some feeler gauges, and our spec is about 0.06 millimeters, so we want to find a feeler gauge close to our spec and measure it out. So here's our spec, 0.06, and here this is technically not going to be like the ideal way to measure it, but just so you guys can see, I'm going to put the skirt sideways here. But all we're doing is just testing how much drag is on this feeler gauge right here. You shouldn't have to force it in. Of course, this is a really thin, this is pretty much tinfoil feeler gauge, but you shouldn't have to force it in. At the same time, it shouldn't slide in and out too easily. There should just be a little bit of drag, and that's what I feel here. Now I'm gonna check it in a few different spots, but it seems like this piston is right on spec. Here I'm just gonna check it in another spot with the way the piston's actually gonna be orientated in the engine. And that feels good. So we know our piston is good to go. Now we need to check our piston ring. Now this bike only has one piston ring, so that's all we'll need to measure. Here I'm going to place our piston ring into the bore of our cylinder. Now this one is not directional at all. It doesn't have any letters or any markings indicating up or down. We're going to square this down into our bore with our piston here. Just want to push it down a little ways, get it as square as possible. There we go. And now here, you guys might be able to see there's a small gap between the end of the piston ring, and that's essentially what we're measuring with feeler gauges to get our piston ring end gap. Here I'm just going to get my feeler gauge. Sorry if I kind of block the angle for you guys. And here this feeler gauge feels pretty close to what our spec should be. We're good to go. Here I'm going to stuff a paper towel around our connecting rod just so we don't have any chance of dropping a circlip into our bottom end. That would not be good. Now here I'm just gonna get some assembly lube up our wrist pin bearing here. We're gonna install our piston. Arrow faces towards the exhaust. In this case, this is a 2-stroke, so we have exhaust ports. 4-stroke would have the good old exhaust valves. And here we'll slide our wrist pin all the way through, just like that. And now the part that everybody loves or hates, we have our circlip. Let's see if we can work this one in by hand. If not, we'll go get a tool. But this one honestly feels pretty easy. I take that back, I'm gonna go get a tool. So here I'm just gonna get it started by hand. We'll make sure it pins all the way in. I'm just gonna get started by hand. And we'll use some needle nose pliers to help us once we've kind of got everything aligned. Just like this. We can work it on in there. We rotated it a little too much. Let's try that again. There we go. Both circlips are in place. Now here you probably can see some little silver marks here on the edge of the piston, but that's not actually in the metal. That's just on this coating here. This is kind of an anti-wear coating to help with break-in in the first few hours that the piston's in the bike. That's nothing to worry about right there. But yeah, so we have both circlips in and seated. Here I'm just gonna double check both of them. Both look good, wrist pins in place. Now we can put on our cylinder. Here I'm just gonna throw some assembly lube on the skirt to the piston, and then we can get to throwing on our cylinder. Alright guys, so our piston's all good to go. Now I'm gonna install our cylinder here onto our piston. We're gonna compress the rings with the ring with our finger. Just slide this on very carefully. There we go. I'll carefully slide this down. Get our dowel pins lined up. And there we go. Now I'm gonna go in and snug our cylinder base nuts down with the 12mm wrench, and we're gonna make sure we do this in a crisscross pattern. Now I'm just gonna give all these nuts the final snug down here. We just wanna make sure all these are nice and snug and all evenly torqued. That one's good. That one's good. Good. And the last one here. And good. Here I'm gonna hook up our power valve linkage, and then we can install our power valve cover. One bolt right there, and we'll just pull this up. Gonna move this. Now we're gonna install this little 8mm bolt. Now we'll just snug this down. Before we install the cover, let's grease up our gasket surface. Your gasket into place. Now we can install our cover. Final thing for us to install will be our cylinder head, and here I'm going to install our 2 O-rings. Put a light coating of grease on these just so they don't get pinched on assembly. And here for our cylinder head, we have a high compression Fathead Racing cylinder head that we're going to be testing out. Alright, now I'm going to torque all of these nuts to 20 foot-pounds of torque. And of course here it is very, very important that we're doing a crisscross pattern. And finally, we're going to install our spark plug, and we're just going to snug it up for now. Here when tightening these spark plugs, I like to tighten them a little bit to crush our crush washer there, and then we'll loosen it up a bit, and then we'll retighten them just so we can get a proper feel when tightening these. Then we're going to install the stator plate. Now I'm not going to do anything special timing right now. I'm just going to install it to where it should be from the factory. Here we have 3 Phillips head screws. Now I'm going to line these 2 marks right here at the top of the timing plate or stator plate, and that'll be our baseline for timing the motor. And I'll just go in and quickly snug these 3 screws down. Next I'm going to install our flywheel here. Just slips right on. We'll make sure we line the keyway here with the crank, our Woodruff key. I think we're spinning the crank. There we go, Woodruff keys aligned. Now we're going to install our washer and flywheel nut. And this nut here needs to be torqued down to 40 pound-feet of torque. Now I'm going to install our ignition cover. We can't install it permanently yet because we still have to install our clutch cable here, but I will put this on here temporarily with a new gasket, of course. Alright guys, the engine is all done. Now here I'm going to hustle and really try to get the bike, or get the engine back into the bike. And I'm not going to film it just to save some time. But here I'm going to try and quickly get the engine back into the frame here. And I'll update you guys when we have everything good to go, so you guys can see this thing run for the first time. And here earlier I picked up some of this VP Racing C12 because we are bumping to some really high compression ratios. Here C12 is a pretty high octane fuel which we will be running in this bike. Let's see if I can get a better view. But yeah, this stuff's pretty high octane. I think 113 or 107, somewhere between those two numbers. But yeah, we're gonna be running this stuff. I gotta mix some, put some in a fuel can, fuel the bike up. But yeah, first of all, I just gotta get the bike built. But yeah, it's a pretty trick looking motor, but looks cool, but also needs to perform well too. So yeah, let's get this bike back together. I'm not really gonna film it. I just need to put my head down and really get this thing back together quick because I do not have that much time. It's already getting later in the afternoon. Alright guys, we have the engine bolted in, everything's torqued down, and now I'm going to work on connecting some various breather lines, some of the stuff for the ECU, the power valve breather, we're going to put on the carb. So now that we have the engine actually mounted solid in place, now is the time I like to take the time and actually start attaching cables and all that stuff. Alright guys, so I got the bike back together. Here's the motor in the frame, looking real nice. Went together pretty well. I did break one bolt, one of the bolts that hold the gas tank on. I broke that one. Luckily it broke at the head, but I'll order another one of those, and it can be ridden without that bolt, so no big deal. Now the plastics are actually kind of dusty. This one's not too bad right here, but if we look at the front fender, it's actually kind of dusty since this bike's been sitting so long. So yeah, right now I need to get some coolant in it. I just checked the oil level's good. So I just need to get some coolant in it, and I also need to mix some fresh gas. I think this is going to be the first time this bike ever sees race fuel, and it kind of needs it, otherwise probably going to have a lot of detonation. So yeah, I'm going to mix up some C12. I'm going to be running straight C12 here because anything less, and I'm probably going to have to rebuild the motor again because of detonation. But yeah, that's what I'm going to be working with here. So I'm going to mix 5 gallons of that into a gas can. I'm sure I have an extra one somewhere. And yeah, get this thing firing up. Now I was thinking of going in and kind of refinishing the pipe, but here I think it looks nice the way it's kind of browned or kind of purple bluish, so I'm not going to mess with that. I'm just going to leave that alone. Only thing that kind of not really worried about, but the only thing kind of in the back of my head right now is the sealant for the cases is still pretty fresh, but it still had a few hours, so it should be good for at least 1 or 2 quick runs. And yeah, got everything back together. Here I'm gonna throw some coolant in it, mix some gas, and man, last time I had race fuel on one of my bikes was probably when I first bought my YZ125. We ran a great tank of race gas in that for break-in, but I've never really actually committed to race gas, so this is gonna be something pretty new to me. But anyway, let's get some coolant in this thing, let's get some gas in this thing, because the tank completely empty, and see if it starts. Well shoot guys, I think the bike just ate up 40 bucks of gas. The whole tank was dry, I'll give it that, but let's get it started now. Start it on the choke, see if it starts, and see if we have a fancy pile of parts or a working bike. So we got oil, we got coolant, good to go. It's been a while since this thing has ran, so it's probably gonna take kicks. Take a few kicks. Alright guys, so it might be just the jetting's off, or it could be all the motor changes, but guys, this thing absolutely wants to take off with the slightest bit of throttle. Now I know the timing is set pretty neutral right now, or set, you know, from OEM factory spec. I'll have to read the plug after a few more times of running it to get an idea of the jetting. It doesn't feel crazy lean, it just kind of feels like motor characteristic now. But it probably is running a little bit lean. I'll have to check up on what jets we're running after I can pull the plug. But man guys, just like by playing with the throttle, this thing feels crazy responsive. Again, it could just be the lean jetting. If it is jetted lean right now, that could be it. But yeah guys, this thing, happy to hear it running. No weird rattles, no weird noises. One thing though is I do need to go in and kind of redo how I installed the kickstart, because it kind of goes like halfway down before it engages. Yeah, it's running good, no weird noises. And yeah, again, jetting could be way off, or it could just be the characteristic of this feel on this, you know, cylinder head. But yeah guys, nothing too crazy sounding. I was surprised it started right up. Now I couldn't get like a full kick stroke out of it because again the Kickstarter was kind of misaligned. But yeah guys, it's running. 125 is back. Hey.